Welcome to the Word for Life podcast, a daily devotional covering the entire Bible from Genesis to Revelation.
In Exodus 21, the Lord now gives detailed commandments for how Israel must live. Interestingly, the first set of rules are about how Israelites must care for their servants. You see, servants were the most weaker section of the society, and therefore they were the most neglected. But God gives them importance in the law. In those days, some Israelites sold themselves and, in rare cases, even sold their family members. The main reason was to survive some extreme financial crisis. But God provided commands so that such servants will not be exploited, even though they have sold themselves because of a financial crisis. For example, if you read verse 2 and 3, it says, "If you buy a Hebrew servant, he is to serve you for 6 years, but in the seventh year he shall go free, without paying anything. If he comes alone, he is to go free alone. But if he has a wife when he comes, she is to go with him." You see, this means that a servant will not be a permanent servant. The length of his service is restricted. Friends, you can see that these laws protect the rights of servants rather than their masters. So, in God's eyes, we understand from this that these servants should be treated as human beings rather than somebody's personal property. If you read verse 20, it says, "Anyone who beats their male or female slave with a rod must be punished if the slave dies as a direct result." Again, you can see that God gives importance to slaves. Also, people back then kidnapped people and took them as their servants. But verse 16 says, "Anyone who kidnaps someone is to be put to death, whether the victim has been sold or is still in the kidnapper's possession." Also, we must understand that this chapter is a handbook for the judges of Israel. This is like a reference manual for judges. And that is why Israelites cannot deal with their servants by themselves. In verse 6, it says, "Masters must bring their servants before the judges so that fair justice will be done to them." For example, if a servant wants to be with his master and does not want to go free, then his master will bring him to a judge, and the judge will verify whether this is true. Only the judge will pierce the servant's ear with an awl. This ear piercing, we must understand, is not a cruel act but a voluntary action by the servant. And this happens only when the servant desires to remain a servant. And also notice how God gives importance to servants in verse 26 and 27. It says, "When a slave is beaten, he must be given freedom as a compensation." In this chapter, we also see that the Lord gives commands about people who commit murder. Again, you will notice that the point God is trying to make is human life is valuable. Human life cannot be compromised by anything on this earth. So, God says a murderer must be put to death. If the murder happens in a family, again the murderer must be put to death. And if somebody is injured, then they must be financially compensated. But if the murder was not done intentionally but accidentally or without enmity or malice, then the judges will not put the murderer to death. If a human is killed by an animal, its life will be taken. All these laws highlight just one thing, and that is there is intrinsic value for a human being. A human being is valuable. Also, you will see in this chapter that even though judges are given power to judge cases, they must not misuse their power. They must not give more punishment than necessary. For example, in verse 24 we read, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. Some people think that this command literally means that Israelites can mutilate other people physically. But this statement only means that punishment must not exceed the crime. Judges of Israel must not take 2 eyes for 1 eye, must not take 2 hands for 1 hand. That means judges of Israel must fairly judge, only give punishment according to the crime. Friends, overall, chapter 21 tells us that slaves must not be neglected simply because their masters are more powerful in society, or victims should not be neglected simply because people who injured them or caused harm to them are more powerful or influential in society. In fact, according to God, victims must be fairly provided justice. You see, when Israelites were slaves in Egypt, God carried them on eagle's wings and brought them to Himself. When Pharaoh murdered Israel's male children, God punished him by killing his firstborn. God showed great mercy and provided justice to Israel. Now, Israel must be merciful to their servants and maintain justice to those who are victimized. Friends, believers today have been shown greater grace than the Old Testament Israel. Jesus has graciously forgiven all our sins. And so, we too are called to show mercy and be just in all our dealings.
Thanks for listening. We'll see you tomorrow for the next episode of the Word for Life podcast.